keeping a strong focus on our targets. So thank you very much for listening, and I will conclude session 4 now.
Thank you very much, Mary, for chairing and for organizing this excellent session. And also thank you to all panelists for your valuable contribution to this session. Now I would like to invite here our next session leader and chair, Owunç Uysal. Owunç represents European Environmental Agency, and Owunç will chair the session expanding the SDGs monitoring with non-traditional data sources. So Owunç, please go ahead.
Hi everyone, welcome to this session. I'm very excited again. The excitement never wears off, I guess. So, for those who don't know me, I just work at the European Environment Agency for more than 1.5 years. But before that, I was at the other side of the Great Divide, which also is my session's design is based on, because I will try to bring these two different worlds together. Before that, I worked at the Turkish Statistical Institute for more than 15 years. Right from the start on SDGs. Before that, OECD's quality of life framework implementation. Before that, economic statistics, surveys or other areas. So mainly after moving from statistical office, I went to the Can I have the next slide, please? Yeah. I moved to the evaluations, assessments, interpretations area, which is quite different species than official statistics. So it's like I'm kind of a ghost. I can move between two different worlds, move and see the quite difference of two different worlds. And I thought I was exaggerating this because it was a huge transition. But after participating in this expert meeting, I'm quite confident that I'm not exaggerating. And this divide with the official statistics and the other community, other sustainability monitoring and analysis community, needs to be resolved somehow. And this is how we designed our session. So at least this is my take from the yesterday's and today's discussions. Slide, please. Although official statistics has its own unique aspects, especially having the national ownership of the sustainability monitoring, having the most overarching umbrella of sustainability on any other reports on global level, having the official data and quality assurance framework. We also have the SDG community needs to stay relevant to the current discussions, especially not on the national level, but on the regional and global level. On national level, of course, it's the only coordination of focal point, but on the regional and global level, it needs to stay relevant. So that's why we designed this session and invited many speakers from outside of the statistics area, inside and also outside. Without further ado, without further babbling, I would like to invite my first speaker. She's also from my agency, Beate Holbeck. She's an economist and she's working as a senior expert on sustainable finance at EEA. Before, she worked on sustainable finance, economic transition, and environmental economics at various universities and the German Environment Agency. Currently, she's interested especially in transparency and transition finance. Beate, can you hear us?
Yeah, thank you very much, Orange. Thank you for having me. Thank you for this nice introduction. I'd like to share my screen with you. Can you see the slides? Because I cannot get any feedback yet because I cannot see any signs. You have to say it. Can anybody see? Everybody see my slides?
Yeah, we can see your slides right now.
Yeah, thank you, Orange, for this nice and kind introduction. My name is Beate Holbeck, and I'm about to talk about expanding SDG monitoring with no traditional data sourcing, as we in the EEA, this is the European Environment Agency, are sitting with the analytical expertise and the development of a reporting infrastructure, not only for member states, but also from industry and other sources. And it could be of interest for you, the newest development on reporting on European level, and that is what I'm trying to introduce to you today. The first step is that everything, so to say, started with the EU Green Deal, or is outlined to the EU Green Deal, that is Europe's green growth strategy. And this green growth strategy comes with a number of subsequent legislation and environmental and social targets. When it comes to the environment, and as we are an environment agency, we are focusing on the environment. That means that it comes with the target of climate neutrality or resilient housing, circular economy, zero pollution, and healthy ecosystems. And that is a target for 2050. And all of us need to understand how to reach those targets. That means that we need indicators to measure progress towards those targets. And as the biodiversity and the climate is not only affected by member states, but also by subsequent layers as the industry or the consumers, we are developing indicators that relate to those different types of related people and groups. So that means the EU Green Deal that aims at transforming EU's economy for a sustainable future comes also with a sustainable finance agenda and framework. And this relates to what I just said. First of all, we are setting targets, for example, the 2030 climate targets. Then we are changing the regulatory framework if it is necessary. And then we also trying to understand and analyze how we finance this great transition. And this financing, the great transition, comes with the action plan for sustainable activities that is here shown in this little sign, financing sustainable growth. With those sustainable finance framework comes a complete new data, new area of data sources to monitor progress. The Sustainable Finance Framework relies on two pillars. One is the EU taxonomy. I'm about to talk about and introduce this tool to you in a moment, but also with other components of transparency, namely disclosure requirements for listed companies. That is called the Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive. The Sustainable Finance Framework comes also with so-called benchmark regulation and green bond standards. Those are standards that help to rely your investment to certain widely accepted benchmarks. For example, the stock exchange benchmarks in your countries or something like that. And the EU has formulated new legislation that relies those benchmarks from the stock exchanges to your investment behavior. Another quite important tool is the so-called Sustainable Finance Disclosure Regulation that helps the financial institutions to advertise and also to structure their sustainable portfolios. So now let's jump to the EU taxonomy. What is the EU taxonomy? It is a classification for sustainable activities, kind of a lexicon, or I don't know, as a very thick book, you can say more than 1,000 pages, that explicitly describe those activities that are found and defined as sustainable. And you can imagine it was a number of work that started earlier in 2018, but the EU is not the only international union that gives itself a taxonomy. We see now a number of taxonomies are popping up in Canada, in Russia, all over the world, especially in China and Asian areas. There you see a number of taxonomies that classify certain activities as sustainable, whereas others are kept out. Therefore, it has a kind of binary characterization or feature. That means as soon as your activity is in, then it is a sustainable activity. As long as it is out, this activity is not claimed as sustainable. Whereas the CSRD reporting itself that I showed you here, its Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive, is only about reporting. It is not deciding if a company is sustainable or not. That is not the issue on the reporting file. I'll tell you about it a moment later. So how to decide what is a sustainable activity? That is, it makes those activity is required to make a substantial contribution to at least one of the 6 environmental objectives. We have defined those environmental objectives. It's about climate, it's about biodiversity, it's about the circular economy, etc. But if we take one activity, for example, a windmill, we check if this activity is making a substantial contribution to climate change mitigation. And if we decide a windmill is a good activity and makes a substantial contribution, then the first box is checked. Then we have to do an additional check, namely the do no significant harm check. That means this activity, in my example, the windmill, is not allowed to make a significant harm, to put a significant harm to biodiversity, for example. So you cannot put your windmill in a nature 2000 area or an area that is protected for biodiversity reasons and claim that this activity is sustainable. only windmills that are built in areas where that are categorized at possible non-harmful areas for windmills are claimed to be sustainable. But last but not least, those activities need to comply with minimum safeguards. Those are minimum social safeguards. They don't need, that are not allowed to be built with child labor, etc. That is what is everything that is in our regulation. So, as you can imagine, the negotiations of those activities that are in or not in have been time-consuming. We discussed this with industry, with NGOs, with environmental experts, and we came up with a report of the technical working group. And this report has as an annex those technical screening criteria I just explained. Here you can see the 6 environmental objectives, but let us go on because it's quite important to understand the complete concept. Namely that, let me give you an example. Not only windmills, which are a no-brainer, are in the EU taxonomy, but the platform itself also advises the Commission to take on restoration plans. And here you can see how our activities are structured. We have an activity that is fully explained. It takes place, etc. Those are the criteria, and then it comes with criteria for the other 5 other environmental objectives. So we already have adopted one EU taxonomy, namely on climate change, mitigation and adaptation, and the EU taxonomy on the other environmental objective is still in the making. And is currently there is a public consultation on the criteria that the platform submitted to the Commission, because it is up to the Commission to adopt those criteria and put it into legislation. Next slide. Now we come to the other aspect, the other pillar of the European Sustainable Finance Agenda. This is the Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive. It is a guidance on change because it requires the companies to think the first time ever about their environmental and social materiality. What is this materiality? It means that the companies need to check their environmental and social impact for scope, scale, and irremediability. If the scope, scale, and irremediability is high enough, the company needs to report on it. That will bring another piece of data from the companies we haven't experienced yet. For the companies itself, it can be used. It can be used as a guidance on change because, as you can see here, the European standard setter is the so-called EFRAG. This is a private association that has been sitting together, negotiating possible standard, and came up with the first draft of standards that have been submitted to the Commission. And the Commission itself sits now with the task to put those proposals into legislation. And it comes with 5 environmental standards for, as you can see, not only for climate change, but also for water, for biodiversity, resources, etc. But also, and that might be of interest for you especially, with 4 social standards. I focus now on the environmental standards. We have drafted a number of very explicit indicators that show what the companies are polluting or what the companies are emitting. But only the climate change standards are mandatory. All indicators that are in the climate change standards are mandatory. All others are up to the materiality check of the company, as I just said. And I'll try to show you a kind of data you can expect to see. These are so-called transition plans, meaning that we also require the company to think about what is their relation to the environmental targets of the EU, for example, when it comes to the biodiversity. When it comes to the biodiversity, the EU has came up with a nature restoration plan, and for example, the decline of pollinators is reversed, or 25% of agricultural land is under organic farming management, or at least 25,000 kilometers of free-flowing rivers are restored, etc. And if the company is coming up with the transition plans, then it can rely its reporting, its data, we call it data points, to this EU Nature Restoration Plan. All those data will finally be put into a single data access point. That is a digitalized version of all management reports of all listed companies in Europe, besides very small micro companies. So those companies not only need to report on the CSRD, but also on the taxonomy. So therefore, we have a two-folded output of this framework, namely, we see what they invest in taxonomy-aligned activities, meaning in sustainable activities, but we also see what are their plans for other activities that are not yet in the taxonomy or are transitional in their way of thinking. So altogether, the CSRD, the Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive, helps you to identify your transitional needs as a company, and the EU taxonomy tells you what to invest in. And both of it are related to transition and transitional indicators, which are instrumental for management and essential for financial decision. When I'd like to close with an idea or with a kind of overview on SDGs and sustainability reporting in Europe. From the taxonomy, you'll get new data from aligned investment provided by selected listed companies that you can use in order to monitor the progress of your companies towards the SDGs. And you also will get new data from economic transition. That is under the CSRD, the Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive, that is also provided by selected listed companies. And both data will flow into the single data access point in Europe, a digitalized version of management reports in a certain format that you can easily read and compare. And by this, you can complement your data with other data sources, and you can validate, for example, your data. Last but not least, I'd like to say that not only the EU is working on sustainability reporting for companies, but also the international IFRS, the International Financial Reporting standards, have developed a sustainability branch, and that means in the end also the United States and also all other listed companies are going to report against a sustainability standard. There are a number out of the a number of sustainability standards are out there, and I hope you can make use of it in order to enrich your reporting. So that's it. Thank you for your attention, and I'm looking forward to getting your feedback, whatever. Either in a verbal or in a written form. If you want to come back with anything, please write me an email or address Orange. Thank you for your attention.
Thanks a lot. Thank you very much, Beate. Let me just check the floor if you have any quick reactions. Because if not, I'd like to share my very short experience on this corporate sustainability reporting. Exactly 1 week after the formal adoption of the global indicator list for the very first time in 2017. Exactly 1 week after, I came to the office and the phone rang, and I open it, say hello, hello. We were wondering how we should know the formal responsible agency about corporate sustainability reporting. I mean, I wasn't even sure about the existence of the indicator, let alone the responsible agency. But they were very keen to have this reporting on corporate level, because it's a very hot topic, especially when you try to communicate with the private sector. Digitalization and sustainability, they say not SDGs or sustainability, they say ESG, environmental social governance. I mean, that's their language, but the corporate sustainability reporting is very important for them. And there's a huge money potential is waiting to be tapped with laying the standards on what is sustainable and what's not. And again, we will have another presentation from JRC, which will also touch upon this issue and have to identify it. So if you don't have any quick reactions, oh, we have Ireland, Mary.
I would just like to ask Beta, is it easy to expose greenwashing by companies? Thank you.
Yeah, to be honest, it is quite difficult to avoid greenwashing. Nevertheless, I really think with a stable and concise set of indicators, we are able to understand the transitional needs and also the emissions from the companies. And together with the civil society, it will be helping us to avoid greenwashing. That is our approach, so to say, to keep it with the company, this materiality assessment on one hand, but on the other hand, to have the civil society as a watchdog, and also the competitors as a watchdog, because in the end, all of us want to move forward. Also the companies, they want to understand where to invest in, etc. And therefore, I really think that transparency and clear guidance, and that is provided by the taxonomy, is a helpful tool. That doesn't mean that we as member states or as European Union can easily agree on what is sustainable and sustainable activity. And some of the activities that are in the taxonomy might be seen as greenwashed from another perspective. But if this is the case, you should take your voice and put it into the public consultation, have your say, so to say. And I'm happy to say that currently the EU Commission is run a public consultation on the criteria for a new piece of EU taxonomy on biodiversity and on water, etc. And if you read those criteria and think, okay, they are not green or sustainable enough, you should have your say and indicate your proposals for change or something like that. So together with the civil society, I hope we will avoid greenwashing as much as possible.
We have another question from Norway. Please, Lee.
Thank you. And thank you very much, Beate, for this presentation. I think it's a very important source for data in the coming years. And I also think we have to be active from an NSO perspective in the development of accounting standards. This is things going on in the countries. And I also noticed this hearing that you have already consultation on the taxonomy now. Currently. So just encouraging NSOs to be active and follow this work because we can tap this as a source for our business statistics in several areas. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Beate, may I come in quickly on this topic? At the same conference that I mentioned before, Gerard also mentioned that they were approached by Ministry of Finance, probably especially on this topic. So we will see the partnerships that we talk very much with the Ministry of Finances maybe on this issue. Thank you.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, the DG General Directive on financial markets and stability is holding the pen for those activities. It is quite important for the financial resource, so to say, in the international negotiations. Yeah.
Beate, can you keep up with us after the lunch for one more question? Because we have 2 minutes and we have a question from Monika Gorcelak from Statistics Poland.
If you use 3 more minutes.
Yeah, okay, good. Okay, we gained 3 more minutes. Then I'm asking the question, is EEA planning to use these new data sources related to Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive for monitoring progress of companies towards sustainability on the macro level?
It is not yet decided. Thank you for this question. It's not yet decided how the EEA is using those data because the single data access point is not yet in place, but is about to come. And depending on how it's looked like, the EEA itself will decide how to deal with those data. But normally we don't deal with corporate data. What we do is we hold the pen for industrial polluters, as you may know, and provide a data infrastructure. So I'm not sure what is the role the EEA is playing. But I can confirm you, we are sitting as an observer in the board, in the EFRAG board that develops the CSRD standards. And we have submitted an opinion on the standard drafts to the Commission. And we are also a permanent member of the so-called Platform on Sustainable Finance that develops the taxonomy. So me and my colleagues, we are negotiating there the criteria, providing expertise on the environmental status and also providing data, whatever works. Yeah, but it's not yet decided.
Beate, we have one last question from the One Goal Initiative for Governance. Please, the floor is yours.
Hi, my name is Alev Mine. I would like to suggest that there should be a couple more measurements when it comes to ESGs, because, or ESG, the concept, because there are two issues of concern. One is ESG is about the sustainability of the company, maybe of the industry, but not of the world. And so there should be a measurement about what are the social impacts beyond, the employees and their immediate needs, and what are the environmental impacts beyond what the company would require for itself and for its industry. And on another, I guess, point about ESG, there needs to be a measurement of the de facto monopolization of either the returns or the decision-making power or capability within one's industry and within, I guess, an extent that would be limited by some functional barriers, because there is a lot of pressure to invest in one's value chain. So what happens is that the companies who have the power to invest, they can go ahead and acquire the I guess decision-making capability of their value chain, and that goes up and down, but that also goes sideways. So after a certain steps, or a certain number of steps or iterations, this power is expanding, expands to whichever extent is possible on a functional basis. So there should be a question about how monopolized the industry becomes through this process. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I mean, I share some parts of your concerns, but from what I understood, you are having concerns on the monopolization of the power of those companies. That is exactly a point that is quite important, because the companies are also required to report on their supply and value chain. And this is also related to so-called due diligence of the companies, meaning that they require to keep international treaties into to integrate them into their decision-making, etc. But what I really think is that this tool of transparency allows the civil society and also the supply chain to disclose their well-doing, so to say, to disclose that they are already on their way to transit their businesses. When it comes to who are those companies that disclose, those are listed companies, the huge one, you are completely right. And would they monopolize the others, the small and medium ones? No, I don't think so. But what I really think is that the sustainable finance framework will require all companies to think on their impact on the environment and also on the society. And you're completely right. It doesn't show everything. It's only related to corporate behavior and to workforce or staff. etc. And we need much more data on other parts of the society, not employed by the listed companies. Nevertheless, it is a part of the puzzle, so to say. It does not answer all questions, but it can help to understand the transformation of the big companies. We don't know yet how the first reports will look like. We don't know the reaction of the companies. It's not yet adopted by the Commission. I hope that answers your question.
Dear Beate, many thanks for your participation. I hope you will stay with us in the afternoon session. I mean, we won't have any more Q&As, but still, thanks a lot.
Thank you for having me, and thank you for this vivid audience. And please come back to any questions, with any questions to me, and or Wunsch. Thank you very much. It was a pleasure. Have a nice lunch.
Thank you. Bye.
So now it's time to stop the session for a lunch break, and please be back at 2:30. So we start afternoon session, the same session. We'll continue the same session. Enjoy your lunch. Thank you.
Sort of busy up here and 2 minutes over time. So we'll just dive right back into session number 5. So Wunsch, you go ahead.
Hi again, everyone. For almost 2 days, I've been mentioning conference happened like 6 months ago, Statistics for Future conference. And I listened to a great session in there. It was session 5. And one of the presenters was Richard Hayes. And I reached out to him, and he gladly accepted to present in here as well. So I'd like to directly introduce him. He's the Deputy Chief Economist at Office for National Statistics in UK. He participated in the SNA 2025 revision task teams and led the Beyond GDP sprints for the UN Network of Economic Statisticians, which was established 2 years ago if you follow the UN Statcom decisions. So I'd like to turn to Richard. Richard, can you hear me?
I can. Can you hear me?
Perfect. Yeah.
Excellent. Thank you very much.
Floor is yours.
Thank you. And thank you very much for asking me to join you at this event. I'm very sorry I can't be there in person, but I'm hoping you can see my slides. And I'm going to present you some materials for the UN Network of Economic Statisticians on the work we've been doing around Beyond GDP. Fairly obviously, as Deputy Chief Economist, I'm very focused on our economic measures. And why am I talking about Beyond GDP to a group working on the SDGs who've very much already gone beyond GDP? Let's move on to the next slide and let's tackle that question first. Essentially, even within the economic statistics community, there is a wide variety of different users who have very different needs. There are those who work in central banks or finance ministries who need purely economic data to aid their decision making. But there's many who look to economic data to give them a wider perspective on society than maybe we would encourage them to, and definitely more than we would think that the data is able to carry. Economic data has limitations. It is very good for what it measures. It is not very good for what it doesn't. And I think we're very much part of an agenda looking at, in support of the UN Secretary General's Our Common Agenda document, which recognised the need for a wider range of complements to GDP and the traditional economic measures. This type of question is one that we've already started on. So many of you will be aware of the system of environmental and economic accounting, the SEA, which looks at the environment from at least a monetary perspective, but also wider into volumes. And the UN have published another report just a few months ago, thinking about how to take this agenda forward. But if I say just a little bit, if we move on to the next slide, about the UN network of economic statisticians and where we come in. So the UN network was established in 2021, as a bunch just said. It sprung out of a group that was called the Friends of the Chair for the UN Stats Commission from a economic statistics perspective, which is a group of national statisticians, leading statisticians who were supporting the chairs of those meetings. We developed the network because we wanted to have the capacity to engage together more, to look at best practice, to look at innovation, very much outside the traditional S&A agenda, thinking about new topics, rising topics, and particularly areas where economic statistics needed to work in tandem with others. And later on in these slides, I'm going to say a little bit about some of our initial findings, which do stray quite significantly into the world of social statistics. And we very much have always recognized that we're not the best people to be attempting to lead or guide that work. And so I'm delighted to say that the UN Stats Commission earlier this year, there was a Social Friends of the Chair group, which was established, which is chaired by Hungary and Mexico, and which over the next few months is going to be setting out their work agenda, and very much the things I'm going to describe to you here, which came out of our first set of sprints last year into this topic, into Beyond GDP. We're going to look to deliver on the issues and recommendations that we raised in tandem with the Social Friends of the Chair, dividing the work on where it seems most appropriate. So through 2022, we undertook a sprint on the issue of Beyond GDP. We plan to run a second series between June and October, and I can make if anyone who is interested in those, please do get in contact. I'll make my contact details available, and we'll give you an opportunity to see the work as it is developed. And our aim very much is to complement the UN's drive, particularly in and around as it works to identify the headlines of Beyond GDP measures which it wishes to support, through more bottom-up work to look to ensure that we have coherency and consistency between the metrics that we're producing and using. I'll say a little bit more about that in just a second. Let's move on to the next slide. So one of the key findings from the first set of sprints was effectively this question of how far beyond GDP do we want to go, recognizing that this pretty much immediately takes you beyond the bounds of what you might traditionally think of as an economic question, very much needing us to think about the trade-offs between the economy, society, and the environment, which of course is an arena that pure economic statisticians like myself maybe are not the best people to necessarily think about, although there are components of that where we think we have something to offer. Very much looking at Lord Layard's recent book on well-being and previous work in this domain, it's clear that well-being pretty much has to be central in our way of thinking about Beyond GDP. But well-being of citizens, and particularly subjective measures of well-being, are obviously affected by all sorts of things. They're affected by personal decisions about the family, about the way people want to live their lives. They're affected by luck and circumstance. It's quite sunny here at the moment, so it's a good day. But obviously, those types of things we want to set to one side in some ways when we're thinking about the policy decisions that we want to provide data for policy users to be making. And so thinking about how we ensure that there are statistics which support those areas, those policy outcomes that we can directly target through policy decisions is clearly a contribution that we need to make, even if well-being in some form ends up being the ultimate objective. And very much in that process of reaching out, I think the thing that immediately became very clear to us was that there was a lot of people, as the quote describes, who were in what I would describe as beyond GDP community, but they might describe as the well-being community or an SDGs community or a wider landscape. And so it's very important for us to think about how we bring in a wide variety of voices. Let's keep going on to the next slide. And part of this is very much the need to bring a complex landscape together in a way that we're able to think about. So essentially, if we were to be talking about that trade-off on the previous set of slides, if I was talking about economic measures of human capital and another group of statisticians were talking about the number of people in education, we clearly want there to be a common framework within which we're thinking about these things. We don't want me to be excluding human capital for secondary age children, for example, whereas I'm just focusing on primary, whereas the social statisticians measuring those in education may be measuring those in primary and secondary education. So thinking about how we bring consistency across the piece and how we think about the relationships that come. This is a diagram that I stole from the UN statistical classification list of domains. And as you can see, even here, an issue which initially feels relatively simple to get our minds around, capital. Those blue boxes at the very bottom, the darker blue boxes, show that even the topics of capital take us across a wide range of domains and into all sorts of statistical areas. And the need to make sure that we're thinking about these on a consistent basis was very much one of the things that we identified that we wanted to think about. Let's move on to the next slide. I think the other thing we identified was that the statistical community in the beyond GDP space had been anything but lazy. In fact, we had produced a wide and very strong variety of complements to GDP already in all sorts of ways, meeting different designs and different styles of statistical product. And actually what we found that users were finding was that the landscape was overly complex, and trying to navigate to which metric was the most appropriate metric to meet their policy need was not always very easy. They're often very similarly titled, very closely related products with very fine differences between them, which if you don't understand where those differences come from, can lead you to pick the wrong method or the wrong basis on which to analyze the problem that you're thinking about. And so one of the key findings that we had from the sprint was that one of the things we definitely had to do was to map the existing landscape of these wide varieties of different types of metric. Think about how we navigate and signpost users to the right metric, but also that process we expect to identify some gaps in our toolkit where we can think about what we want to deliver. And very much, I think here, this is where I see a potential for this work to come through and to help to complement the SDGs. Because this is not some alternative framework. It very much, for me, is a toolkit where we marshal the data that we have available to us, such that frameworks, such as the SDGs, can have that visibility and sight of the metrics which are being offered to it, and to decide which it prefers to use. Let's keep moving forward. Next slide, please. The next thing we identified was that history didn't begin with Stiglitz, Sen, and Fitoussi, which a seminal report, absolutely vital in the way that we think about these issues today. but very much part of a history. From 1948 to 1968, the system of national accounts, the SNA, was developed, and this very much made hard decisions on what was in and what was not in. But the authors, when they were making those decisions, weren't thinking about those things that they excluded from the SNA as unimportant. They just thought of them as different and requiring a different home, which would allow them to be given the due focus and attention that they deserved and required. And so in 1968 to 1974, there was a fairly rapid burst of activity led by Richard Stone out of Cambridge, which offered forward a system of demographic and social statistics, the SDSS, which was put forward to the UNSC. This covered 10 domains, and I'm going to come back to those in a minute. But obviously, the sort of next 15 years, 15, 20 years, various attempts were made to deliver on the SDSS. These stalled primarily due to data challenges and a lack of data availability. And so we see a lot of evolution in indicators in different statistical domains, which, whether implicit or explicit, often drew from the SDSS system as a founding base. I think obviously over a period of 20 years, you're going to see lots of revision and improvement, and that's what we want to see. But what we see in 1993 and 2008 is the system of national accounts coming back to these domains and topics and saying, well, we never said they were unimportant. We just said they needed to be done somewhere. And so the SNA in those two revisions did partially incorporate 6 of the 10 domains in what it would term as satellite accounts. Now, it often did so on a monetized basis rather than, so thinking about human capital and the value of human capital rather than, say, the number of people in education. But it did make some attempt to tackle these. And this is really important because as we look at the data we have available, a principle of reusing the strong frameworks, guidance and manuals that we already have very much felt to us to be one of the key recommendations that we wanted to lean into. Let's move on to the next slide. So the proposed way forward that we have proposed and we continue to work on with the social friends of the chair is to come back to our system of governance for how we produce statistics, to think about a system of systems effectively, in the same way that the SDSS was meant to sit alongside the SNA, thinking about how we can deliver a comprehensive picture of the modern world by bringing our systems and data and methods together and ensuring that we have broad consistency, that we are across each domain thinking about where we have opportunities that we may be able to exploit, leaning very much on existing documentation, standards and manuals, reusing materials wherever we can, but thinking about how we then can underpin a framework which allows us to understand where the data is coming from that we wish to use for beyond GDP or well-being, and how we can use it. So let's move on to the next slide, which sort of puts this into a more pictorial form. So obviously today we have those 2 green bubbles in this diagram, the System of National Accounts and the SEER, which cover, in that initial diagram I showed you, these sort of environmental and economic components of the picture. But what we saw very much is the need to come back to the SDSS topic. We call it System of Population and Social Accounts, but the name very much is open for discussion at the minute. It isn't hard and fast. With a view to having those 3 pillars upon which to build a central or wider framework for inclusive and sustainable well-being. Central simply in the sense that it's going to need to draw on data and metrics created by the other three frameworks. Now, many countries operate well-being dashboards, which often are linked to the SDGs, which cover core well-being indicators. One of the things we would like to think about is how much commonality there is between the countries that take these approaches, and one of our sprints in June or September, I think, will be particularly focused on this question, alongside questions about distributional breakdowns and different methods that are currently in place for doing this, as well as thinking about sustainability and the relationship between flows and stocks. Finally, thinking about whether there is the capacity using data which already exists to produce new composite indices like GDP that bring together a vast quantity of data into one metric. As we've identified, and I think we all have experienced, the policymakers need to condense a large quantity of information into a simple set of manageable tools that they can use to guide policy making. Let's move on to the next slide. Now, when people were thinking very much along these lines in the 1970s, I think there were really two problems that they immediately ran into. One was a lack of computational power, and the second was simply availability of data. For many countries, the effort to produce the economic accounts left them very little bandwidth or funding to tackle wider questions. But obviously, we're in a world where data is more readily available than ever before, whether that is digitalized administrative data from government or private sector data. And therefore, we very much come from this from an optimistic point of view that says probably enough has moved on since the 1970s for us to be quite radical in the way that we could think about addressing this, given both the huge quantity of work that's already happened and the opportunities that new data systems and new data availability may give us. And here, particularly thinking about the satellite accounts that I described underneath the system of national accounts, whilst these are not universally taken forward by countries, enough countries have demonstrated their validity, have tested the principles and been able to produce reproducible data and routine data in these fields, which suggests to us that this might be the quickest way of winning, a quick win, essentially, and moving forward by using these developments and techniques and these countries, first mover countries who have piloted this work, to showcase and use these methods rather than having to create new. I'm very mindful about time, so I'm going to move on to the next slide, if I may. And to say, so to just give you a view of those 10 domains that I've referenced a couple of times, they're shown on here. The 4 which we have flashed in yellow, earnings, activities, employment services, health and health services, and social security and welfare services, are ones that we are looking at tackling in pilot form later this year, by mapping what already exists, working with the agencies in these domains who already have a strong knowledge base about where their methods and frameworks came from and how they evolved, with the aim of being able to articulate quickly the strength that lies within those systems, any opportunities for better alignment, and how we can use data from one domain with data from other domains to think about how we can combine and understand some of the key trade-offs that we are thinking about. The 3 we've chosen are 3 which either are pretty much wholly thought about in economic terms, and where the satellite account broadly meets the social and economic needs in that space, through those where probably the SNA managed to deliver an economic picture, sort of like the human capital monetized estimates, but maybe doesn't consider all of the social components about phases of education, sizes of education populations, and these sorts of things. And those where the SNA has made no serious attempt at straying into these territories, where we'll very much be looking to the social friends of the chair to take a far stronger leadership role in those areas. Our sprints, as I say, will be running from June through to September, early October, and I will make those available to you in due course. But I think my next slide asks for any questions. I think I've used my 20 minutes, so I will pass back to Avanch and the chair and welcome any questions. Thank you very much.
Thanks a lot, Richard. I think you finished perfectly on time. We were a bit late to start the session, so no problem from your side. Any quick reactions from the floor? Because if not, I already prepared a question both to Richard and to the floor. But before that, I just wanted to mention that, yeah, we never got into the detail of environmental economic accounts, but there are lots of things to be done in that area as well, apart from the social accounts. But I just wanted to share with you my a recent experience of the Turkey experienced in the beginning of February. We had a very devastating earthquake, if you remember. Lots of damages were calculated, but they were all financial or non-financial economic damages. So if you, for example, wanna hold someone responsible and account for the damages of the actions haven't been taken before the disaster, you can only count the economic accounts, not social, not environmental properly. So there are always arguments against, yeah, you shouldn't measure the invaluable human nature or environment. It shouldn't be quantified. It shouldn't be financialized. It shouldn't be internalized in the finance sector. Yes, but if you don't quantify it, then you can't hold responsible the people with the proper costs. So this is my takeaway, at least, about these capital measurements issue. And apart from that, I'd like to bring a question to the floor. This integrated statistical system for inclusive and sustainable well-being approach. By the way, this wording, I think it's gonna stick because I heard exactly the same wording in the EU level as well. So I dare to use it. This approach is very valuable, and as mentioned in the Future for Economics conference, I believe this proposal needs to tightly to be aligned with the SDGs. So this would also be a great way to help SDGs community to break the silos. This is my takeaway. Anyone care to comment to these remarks? Richard, especially?
I think your first comment about thinking about this from the context of the earthquake in Turkey is exactly right, because I'm an economist. I think in very monetized terms. You'd be surprised if I said I didn't. But even I think there are very important things which are difficult to necessarily shape in that context, simply because the day before that earthquake, people's valuation of some of that natural capital and some of the cultural capital equally that may have been damaged during that event, they might have viewed it differently than they did immediately afterwards. Value is always driven by the context that the goods, services, assets, cultural attributes sit. The last person who speaks a language is maybe we'd put a different value, if we think about them in traditional value terms, than the billionth speaker of a particular language. But as you say, if we don't value things, then the things that we don't value aren't seen as important. And I think this is one of the big cultural problems that we have, that where we don't attribute value, we essentially therefore do not attribute any value, and that I think is a mistake. How exactly you calculate some of those values is an issue where I think we need to be consistent, because if you are going to look at natural capital in the context of that event. I think it's also very important that we're trying to think about how we value cultural capital or human capital. They're not isolated, and so I would encourage people to think like that. And just in terms of the two questions you have here, I think the proposal as we have it very much is to try and help to underpin and support those networks, those frameworks that are thinking about where to draw data from, so that they can have that greater certainty that all the data sources that they are presenting to policymakers and to citizens, that they can explain the trade-offs and the differences between the data. But essentially that is at the heart of our job as statisticians, that if you can't explain where data comes from or how it relates to other data, it loses a lot of its value. And so I see the work that we're proposing very much as bottom-up work, which allows us to provide more of that metadata, that data infrastructure around data, whatever data the SDGs may want to use in its refresh. I think that very much is the way that I would look to make sure that we are delivering something of value to you, and making sure that what we deliver as statistical communities, whether it's environmental, social, or economic, is meeting need. I'll pause there in case anyone wants to come in from the floor.
I think it was quite clear for me, at least. Let me check the floor and the online chat. Okay. Thanks a lot for this great presentation, Richard. I mean, I'm grateful that you responded to my call, and I hope, I wish success to your future sprints.
Thank you very much, and thank you very much for having me. And as I say, if anyone does wish to have the schedule of sprints, if you get in touch with Avunch, I'm sure we can get them through to you. Thank you very much, and enjoy the rest of your conference. Cheerio all.
He couldn't hear me. So, should we move on to the next presentation?
Yeah.
Now, I'd like to welcome Esther from JRC, and she will be the only person presenting physically in my session. We were expecting two, but in the last minute, things changed. So, Esther, would you like to introduce yourself to the statistics people?
Okay. I think I'm on the mic, right? Yes. Okay, so, well, thanks for the invitation to this session. I think it's a very interesting session, and I think, Ovun, you pointed very well that there is a bit this division now with the statistic data and other kind of data. So I'm Esther Mengual. I'm a scientific officer in the Joint Research Center that I will introduce just in my first slide. And today I want to talk to you about life cycle assessment-based data, and in particular about the consumption footprint indicator and how this can be related with the Sustainable Development Goals framework. So what is the Joint Research Center? We are a directorate of the European Commission, and we are kind of the research arm of the European Commission. So our goal is to provide independent and evidence-based knowledge and science as basis for the development of EU policies, with the ultimate ambition of positively impact society. Our work is streaming three main aspects. First is to anticipate which aspects require new policy development, then also integrate knowledge to provide comprehensive information as basis for the development of informed decision-making and policy-making, and first also to evaluate the impact of this policy development. So I'm part of the European platform on life cycle assessment, and we have different work streams. One is to support DG Environment in the development and implementation of the environmental footprint method, which I will talk briefly later. The second is to develop life cycle assessment-based frameworks and approaches to evaluate the environmental impact of EU consumption. Also to test eco-innovation scenarios, green transitions, and policy scenarios. To explore and work on this link between the Sustainable Development Goals and life cycle assessment. To also develop and explore how life cycle assessment can support the policy development when assessing the impact of policies. And finally, to train on life cycle assessment EU policy officers and also national policy officers. So this is the link to the European platform on life cycle assessment. And first, I wanted to introduce briefly life cycle thinking. Life cycle thinking is a core concept for sustainability assessment and targets to evaluate the sustainability of products, systems, organizations, comprehensively and holistically, considering the entire life cycle of a system, product, or organization. This means not focusing on only one step of the supply chain, one step of the life cycle, but considering from the early stages when, for example, a product is designed, the raw materials are extracted from the mines, to the later stages, what is happening with this product, with this system during the use phase, what is happening also at the end of life when this product is not used anymore. Is this going to be disposed? Is this going through alternative pathways for waste management like recycling? Life cycle thinking can be implemented to the 3 dimensions of sustainability. For the environmental dimension, the method is life cycle assessment. And such holistical approach allow us to provide an integrated environmental assessment. Usually life cycle assessment employs a method that includes more than one environmental impact. So in the case of the environmental footprint method, we include 16 impact categories, so you can understand the impacts not only on climate change, which is very common in this type of assessments, but also the impacts on water use, land use, toxicity, human, and in the ecosystem, or impacts due to resource use. And one core or key aspect of life cycle thinking is to identify trade-offs. Identify trade-offs among environmental impacts. For example, if I'm a company and I'm doing a change in my product on how this is designed, I might, for example, target the reduction of energy consumption during the use phase, and I could improve the impact of climate change, for example. But on the balance, I might need more materials to achieve that energy efficiency. So I might increase my impacts of resource use, of toxicity, and I would increase also the impacts on another life cycle stage. So life cycle assessment and having this overall picture of the environmental impact allows us to identify these trade-offs and potentially prevent them. We did a study on how life cycle thinking and life cycle assessment has been and is being considered in EU policy for the last 3 decades. And as you can see here, the mentioning and consideration of a supply chain approach, of a life cycle approach has increased a long time, particularly since 2019 with the publication of the European Green Deal and the different ambitions. In fact, different stakeholders of the EU policy sphere have been highlighting the relevance of life cycle assessment and a supply chain approach. The Council, for example, highlighted that new indicators might need to have this full life cycle approach and vision when assessing products and services. Also, there was highlighted that in relation to the Circular Economy Action Plan and the monitoring of circular economy that we don't only need material footprint indicators, but we need also consumption footprint indicators that take into account this supply chain and what happens before the product arrives to the EU territory. Also, the Committee of the Regions indicated or commented that when assessing the coupling, we also need to have into consideration the entire product life cycle in this evaluation. And last year in the 8th Environment Action Program, it was also highlighted in an article that we need to reduce the consumption footprint and to try to bring it within the planetary boundaries. So there is an increased need and an increased remark of the need to move beyond only territorial indicators and consider what's happening in other world regions due to the supply chain of the products of the systems that are associated to our consumption patterns, to our demand, and for which we are responsible for. So, as I mentioned, life cycle assessment is being central in the European Green Deal and in the different ambitions. Here, as examples, some key policies that are highlighting this supply chain, this life cycle, this circularity also of evaluating different waste streams and coming back to the early stages of the life cycle, like the circular economy, the biodiversity strategy, or the farm to fork. And to support the implementation of this vision in these key policies, we are developing different implementing tools. One is the environmental footprint. Life cycle assessment is a standardized method by an ISO, but the provisions of this ISO are not very strict or not extremely prescriptive, let's say, so they give a space to some maneuver for the practitioner or the person developing an LCA study, and that could lead to potential greenwashing. So in this context, from the Commission, there was the aim of developing this environmental footprint method for products and for organizations, where we are providing further prescriptions from the ISO so that we avoid this maneuver for providing not actual life cycle data regarding environmental impacts. This tool targets the comparison between products or between organizations. Another set of tools, another framework is the one that includes the consumption footprint and the domestic footprint. This instead is a macro scale framework that aims to assess the environmental impacts of EU consumption and production. And this will be the focus of today's presentation, but I wanted to mention that this consumption footprint was developed for the EU level and for the EU country level, but it can be scaled down to regions, to cities, and also to the citizen, as we will see briefly with one of the tools associated to the consumption footprint that we developed for citizens. So what is the consumption footprint? This is a set of 16 life cycle assessment-based indicators that aims to assess the environmental impacts of production and consumption in the EU and in the EU countries. This is a full bottom-up indicator, and we start from a selection of representative products that represents the 5 main areas of consumption which are more relevant in environmental terms, but also in consumption terms. For each of these representative products, we do 2 steps. The first one is to calculate the consumption intensity. And this is a calculation. Usually, we evaluate the consumption footprint for a given year, and this is based on statistical data. And a second step for each of these products is to assess what is the environmental impact of 1 unit of this product. And this is a step that is based on modeling. So here we model with life cycle assessment the entire impacts of the full life cycle. Here is a model, but I wanted to mention also that this model integrates many types of data, including also statistical data. For example, when we are modeling food products, we might use statistical data on crop yields, on the different feedstock diets. So it's also based partly on data coming and reported by countries. And the consumption footprint has been mainly developed to support the development of policies in three main areas. One is on monitoring, and currently the consumption footprint is being a headline indicator in the new 8th Environment Action Program Monitoring Framework, also for the Zero Pollution, the Circular Economy Action Plan, and other dashboards like the Resilience. For the identification of hotspots, the high granularity of the indicator it's based on life cycle data, so we can understand from where the impacts are coming from the area of consumption, from which product, from which life cycle within the product, and even we can go further into detail to understand which areas are a hotspot that might require more attention. And this is relevant in the development of impact assessment of policies when we want to identify which is the problem and what we want the policy to target and to improve. And a third area as policy use of this indicator is to test green transitions or policy scenarios or eco-innovations. Also here, the high granularity of the indicator being a bottom-up indicator and being based on life cycle data allow us to have a high level of detail to change different types of parameters and test then at the macro scale how these changes might have a macro scale effect. And this has been used, for example, in the first Zero Pollution Outlook that was presented last year, where we model what would be the pollution impacts of EU consumption up to 2030 with a baseline scenario following current trends, but also considering EU policy ambitions and how this could change food consumption patterns, or also how the mobility sector could evolve a long time. And again, this step is very relevant when we are assessing the potential policies in the pipeline to understand the different policy scenarios that could be implemented, how these scenarios might have more or less impact in the different environmental aspects. So now that you have an overview of what is the consumption footprint and for which kind of aspects or uses could be employed, we have also been working on understanding better what is the link between the consumption footprint, between the environmental footprint method that is employed in this indicator with the Sustainable Development Goals framework. Originally, the consumption footprint indicator was developed to monitor and to assess SDG 12, because there we are talking about responsible and sustainable consumption, but most of the indicators are territorial, so they are only talking about what is happening in the territory, what is related to production and domestic consumption, but we are forgetting a bit about this all this impact that's happening in other territories, but that we are responsible through our consumption. And of course, we link the consumption footprint with this SDG 12 goal, but you can see here in the slide, we mapped the 16 impact categories of the environmental footprint that are calculated in the consumption footprint with the different SDG targets, and we identified that 11 SDG goals and the different targets underneath can be, or we can provide information about these SDG targets. if we go at the goal level, of course, we identified that this indicator is fully addressing SDG 12, but that there are 10 other indicators that are partially addressed by the 16 impact categories of the environmental footprint. And there are six SDGs, that are not directly addressed, but that are underpinning these consumption patterns with the socioeconomic context that are then evaluated in the consumption footprint. We also wanted to highlight here that with the consumption footprint indicator and the environmental footprint, we can link the SDGs framework with the planetary boundaries framework because we have performed two mappings. On one hand, we mapped, as you have seen, the environmental footprint set of indicators with the SDGs framework. But on the other side, we developed an adapted planetary boundaries framework to these 16 impact categories to be able to evaluate the consumption footprint from an absolute sustainability perspective. So the consumption footprint can allow us to perform this linkage between them. And we are not only evaluating the environmental impacts of consumption, we have started to work also on the social dimension of sustainability. We have started with the food area of consumption by assessing the social footprint with the social life cycle assessment method. And the first step was to map the long list of social indicators in the SILCA database with the SDGs framework. And as you can see here, many SDG goals are addressed, highlighting the SDG 8 talking about work and economic growth indicators. I will skip some of them. And as I mentioned, I wanted to introduce you to the 3 consumption footprint-based tools that we have developed. We have a platform that allows to access the data to the different stakeholders. We have published this year the Member States Consumption Footprint Tool, which is targeting Member States and statistical offices like could be here today. What does this tool allow us? At the JRC, we have developed an assessment for all the EU countries. So we have been using data that is available for all the countries, using data sources like Eurostat, Faustat, etc. But we did a collaboration with the Environmental Agency of Germany to test how would the consumption footprint differ if countries might use national data sources that are not common to all countries, like consumer surveys or other specific data sets from ministries. And we have developed this tool to allow member states to do exactly this, to enter this tool and allow them to change consumption intensity data and to test their own data sources. And the last one is the consumer footprint calculator, allowing citizens to explore their footprint. And I wanted to mention it today because yesterday communication was mentioned, and this tool is aiming not only to talk about the footprint, but also to link all the footprint information and the results with the SDGs framework, and it's actually hosted in the No SDGs platform, and it allows citizens and other stakeholders to explore their footprint, how the consumption is linked to SDG 2 because we are talking about food, or SDG 8, etc. So very quickly, the conclusions, just we wanted to highlight that for assessing consumption and supply chain, we need other type of data that is not targeting the territory, which is more common in official statistics from countries. And that in this case, the consumption footprint and the environmental footprint covers broadly the SDGs framework and can provide data of different types of goals and targets. And also, we think it's relevant, this link with absolute sustainability, because we can evolve positively and reduce relatively our impact somewhere, but we need to have in mind these thresholds because we might not be doing enough. So here in the slides, you will have links to our publications and the links to the different tools. Many thanks.
Thanks a lot, and also for being so swift to finish and wrap up. We finish it with you. So basically, can we know, as for example, as a consumer, can we compare the environmental footprint of a hot shower with the, for example, pack of chocolate? Because I watched something like that. For example, eating 100-gram chocolate would impact the environment 160 times more than a 5-minute hot shower or something like that.
I mean, with LCA, you can't do exactly that. It's not in our tools. At the moment, they are not intended to compare specific things. In the Citizen one, is more intended to provide you with the data and understand my consumption footprint is coming from chocolate because I'm eating a lot of chocolate, or it's coming from energy in the household because I'm having very long hot showers, and then be able to have this information to be able to make a change.
Thank you very much. By the way, for the Russian listening participants, I was informed that in the middle of the next presentation, probably the Russian translation will end. So I just wanted to inform you beforehand. Apart from that, do we have any quick reaction to the life cycle assessment? We have Netherlands. Bo, please.
Yes. Yeah, okay, it's on. First of all, thank you for the presentation. It was really interesting. I was just wondering if we wanted to use the footprints that you presented as an indicator, how does it differ? And maybe what is the additional value compared to other footprint methods based on multiple regional input-output tables?
Okay, this is a common question, and also because traditionally, or there are maybe more examples that are top-down examples using multi-regional input-output. And I would say it's not that there is one that is the best. It depends on the goal of what you are doing and on your study. There are benefits and disadvantages of both approaches. So multi-regional input-output is covering more comprehensively the full economy, while the consumption footprint at the moment is not covering the full economy. We are, for example, still lacking to develop, for example, services. On the contrary, life cycle assessment-based data has a broader coverage of environmental pressures. So we are talking about the order of magnitude of 1,000-something environmental emissions and resource use, and multi-regional input-output is more talking about the hundreds of environmental pressures. So for the environmental footprint, there are two indicators that cannot be assessed, for example, with multi-regional input-output. And I just wanted to comment, when we were developing the consumption footprint, we actually developed two, the top-down and the bottom-up, and we compared them. And then we decided together with our counterpart policy DG on continuing with the bottom-up approach because of this granularity that allows us to understand better the picture of the impact, understand better, and use it for policy development.
Thanks a lot. Portugal, please. And then Brazil.
I also had a similar question. I have another second question, possibly a silly one. I'm sorry, but I was appealed with when you mentioned that you could get information with several layers by regions, and in Portugal we have a carbon footprint and a material footprint, and we also calculating consumption. We don't have regional data, and some users have shown interest in this kind of detail. Do you think it's possible in a way to integrate and to use your project to have regional data like NUTS 2 level? Thank you.
We don't, oh no, I think I don't. No. At the moment, we don't have regional data available. The framework can be implemented at regional level, but with regional data or to be understood. So, for example, for the city level, what we did was a pilot with Torino in Italy. We did a collaboration with a university in contact with the municipality, and we explored the data that they had to do the consumption footprint of the city. And then we developed the framework for them, but it's not that we at the moment have this data available, but we are open also to explore it.
For being mindful of the time, I'll take Brazil's question as the last one, and then move forward.
Thank you, Esther. Thank you very much for your presentation. I guess I have a more broader or perspective question linked to the title of your presentation, the interplay between life cycle assessment and the SDGs. I saw in your presentation that life cycle assessment is the name of a journal, so I suppose the concept is around for some time now. And in this interplay between the SDGs and life cycle assessment, I understand there are gains for both parts. I mean, in terms of when you link the concepts, you give visibility to both of them. Could you comment? How do you see which side, I'll put this way, is getting the better stake on this visibility? Do you think this linkage boosts? It's a form of boosting SDG, one more form, or you see it more the other way around?
In this case, it's more that how LCA can be used to monitor or to assess SDGs, because of course, the LCA, what can gain, we can evaluate or see what we are already covering of the SDGs and understand what is still missing, because LCA is in continuous development, for example, to address emerging environmental issues like plastic pollution. So I see that LCA can benefit from that, not understanding what we are currently covering with the LCA, with social LCA, and what we are still missing. But I think that it's the more gain is the opposite, no? How LCA can help and support the SDGs by quantifying, by monitoring, by assessing, etc.
Thank you very much, Esther, and I think we can release you, and I hope you're glad for the questions.
Thank you so much.
Okay, see you later. Thanks a lot, and for being mindful of time, we should move on to the next presentation. We will have an online guest from Eurostat, Stefan Moll. He is a statistical officer at Eurostat, Estat E2 unit, Environmental Statistics, Account and Sustainable Development. He is leading the team on physical environmental accounts and water. The team produces air emission accounts economy-wide material flow accounts, physical energy flow accounts, and water statistics. Further, the team produces footprint type indicators for materials, air emissions, energy use, and land. So as you can see, it's quite a good complementary after the JRC's presentation. Stefan, can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you.
Perfect. Please, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much for this introduction. Yes, good afternoon. As mentioned, I'm working at Eurostat, the statistical office of the European Union. We have an environment unit, and in this unit, we have several teams. I'm the team leader for the physical accounts. And actually, my colleague, team leader Christine Meyer, was invited. She's in charge of the SDG monitoring at Eurostat, but unfortunately, Christine cannot make it. But maybe that's not too bad because I'm coming more from the production side, from the data. I'm a data cruncher and not so much a policy maker. And I think I understand that the objective of this session 5 is also to get more insights on the data and how they are produced and how they are available and how accurate they are. My presentation has actually two main parts. First, I will provide you with an overview on the footprint type indicators that we produce in my team. And I will focus on the example of carbon footprints estimates based on multi-regional or inter-country input-output modeling. But I will also say something about how the footprint type indicators produced in my team are used by the other team, by Christina's team, for the SDG monitoring by Eurostat. So I start with the production of footprint type indicators. So what domains do we work on? We work on air emissions. So that is the emissions of greenhouse gases and air pollutants. We work on materials extractions, on energy, more precisely the domestic energy use, and land use. For all these domains, we produce or estimate footprints or footprint type indicators. Also, our colleagues in the macroeconomic unit in the national accounts, they also calculate economic footprints, if you want. They calculate or estimate value added as it is sort of connected to consumption. Some fundamentals. Actually, what we produce are consumption-based accounts, which is much, much more than just the footprint type indicators. Probably most of you are maybe familiar with this pyramid of data. So you have at the bottom, you have the primary data, the raw data, if you want. You can assemble them in so-called accounting systems and then derive from those accounting systems, you can have some indicators and even go further and aggregate different indicators to composite indicators. So the footprint type indicators are sitting here at the top of the pyramid, and they are based on consumption-based accountings, which are very, very big data sets, and I will come back to this later. So my point here is just footprint type indicators sit at the top of the pyramid of the information pyramid. Then another fundamental is what is the conceptual basis of the footprint or consumption-based accounts that we produce? We are bound to the system of national accounts, the SNA, and to the conventions and principles in the System of Environmental Economic Accounts, SEEA. So the statistical offices, if they produce footprint type indicators or consumption-based accounts, they are bound to these, let's say, Bibles or methodologies. How do we, in that conceptual or methodological framework of national accounts and economic environmental accounts, how do we define footprints or footprint type indicators? There are certain phenomena associated with production. That can be emissions, that can be extraction of materials, that can be the occupation of a piece of land, that can be water use whatsoever. A certain phenomenon that can be value added, that can be employment. So a certain phenomenon is associated with the production activity. Now, each production activity is actually for the final purpose of being consumed. Yeah, for instance, the production of tires is for the purpose of consuming in the end a motor vehicle, for instance. So, and the footprint type indicators are sort of reattributing these phenomena associated with the production. They are reattributed to the consumption of final goods. The consumption, again, in national accounts is defined as the final demand. For instance, in an inter-country input-output framework, these are two items: the final consumption expenditures by government, households, and non-profit organizations with the code P3. That's an international coding for national accounting items. And the gross fixed capital formation. That is the goods going to investment in a layman's word. Yeah, buildings, machinery, etc. So we have a very, very clear definition of the footprint, which is clearly rooted in the conventions for macroeconomic statistics, the national accounts. On top, we have there may be certain phenomena which are exerted directly by private households. So imagine you are heating your house with natural gas. So you have a natural gas boiler, and that boiler burns natural gas. And this is emission of CO2 and other pollutants not assignable to a production activity, but you assign it, or we assign it in our accounts to the private households directly. So it's more or less added to the CO2 emissions or other phenomena reattributed to the final consumption of households. Now, what kind of methods do we have? We have the input-output modeling, and there we have two options to estimate consumption-based accounts and derived footprint type indicators. The so-called single region model and the multi-regional inter-country model. We also have the method of what we call the coefficient approach. And there some life cycle inventory based information might be pulled in. And we have composite methods where we have combinations of input-output modeling and coefficients approach. Let's say the king method, the golden method is the multi-regional inter-country model. However, it implies quite considerable data requirements, and you need global ingredients, global data sets. And in order to make reasonable estimates of footprint type indicators, you also need a certain resolution of economic activities. So the data requirements are an issue. And that is why we are not as far advanced with the multi-regional input-output modeling as we would wish to be. Now, what is the Eurostat method mix? So due to historical reasons, I mean, the multi-regional input-output modeling became feasible only in recent years. And we started already a couple of years estimating footprints far before multi-regional data sets became available. So for this historical reason, so to say, we have different methods applied in Eurostat. So we started actually 10 years ago or so with single region input-output modeling. And we are still applying this for the case of air emissions and energy use. The multi-regional modeling, which became feasible only recently, has been applied so far only for CO2 emissions and for the cross value added, for the economic footprints. And I will, because that is the golden methodology, I will go into this a bit in more detail later. Then we have the coefficient approach, which we apply for the land use. Has several reasons, data availability, but also constraints as far as the detail or resolution of the input-output modeling concerns. But okay, for that we use coefficient approach. And for the material footprints, we use a kind of composite method where we combine input-output modeling with some exogenous information coming inter alia from life cycle inventories. I will now go into more detail as for the carbon footprints, which are based on the multi-regional input-output modeling. Because it has by far the biggest analytical potential. And I think it's the most interesting one for SDG monitoring, and because it provides consistent global information, which makes it very interesting for sustainable development issues, which probably increasingly will be discussed, having the entire world economy in perspective. The data requirements for such inter-country or multi-regional input-output modeling is, I would say, challenging. So what we use for the Eurostat carbon footprint estimates, we use the Figaro. Figaro is a project between the Joint Research Center in Europe and Eurostat. So coming from this Figaro project, we have now established at Eurostat regular production of inter-country input-output data set. It's a global data set representing the global economy, and it has a breakdown by 46 geographical entities and 64 production activities, industries, if you want. The 46 geographical entities are the EU member states, 27 EU member states, some other European economies like Switzerland and Norway, and then the non-European G20 economies like US, China, Russia, and so on. And then a big block for the non-G20 rest of the world countries. So that is one input, the monetary economic tables. And then, of course, you need the environmental extension or the phenomenon which you assign to production and consumption. In our case, the CO2 emissions. They are provided by my team. For the European member states or the European countries, it's not a big deal because we have a legal base. So we get this information from our member states. but for the non-European countries, we have to estimate the CO2 emissions. And we have set up an estimation machine. So we have exactly the same breakdown as for the intercountry input-output data set. So we have 46 geographical entities and 64 production activities, plus the direct emissions by households I mentioned already. I don't want to bother you, torture you with the model, but it's a Leontief type model. It's standard in econometrics. It's a methodology developed in the middle of the 20th century. It's reproducible if you have the ingredients, I mean the data inputs, everyone can reproduce the results. So it's very transparent. All econometric textbooks explain the methodology. So it's quite common modeling methodology. Yeah, I go over this. The data structure of the modeling results. In our case, it has the format of a final demand matrix, and in a multi-country or interregional country setup, this means we have 2,944 rows. So that is the 64 production activities times the 46 countries or geographical entities. And the columns, there we have the final demand categories, where we have distinguished 5 final demand categories and the 46 geographical entities. So in each of the 46, you have the 5 final demand categories. So that's the shape of the resulting matrix, plus the households, which makes already for 1 year and 1 pollutant or 1 greenhouse gas almost 700,000 data points. Then if you multiply it with your time series, in our case 11 years, you have already 7.5 million data points. And we publish it in form of a flat file. So you have each record represents 1 data point, and it has, I don't know, 10 or 9 dimensions. Yeah, it looks like this. And this is just so the 9 dimensions are the columns. So we have the time, we have the reference area, we have the industry, the counterpart area where the consumption takes place. We have the final demand category, we have the value, we have the decimals, we have the unit measure and the multiplier. So just how to read such a data set. So that is an example. That is the amount 49.9 tons or million tons. That is, in that case, the CO2 emissions emitted by metal manufacturing. That is C24. In India, that is the country of origin of the emissions, caused by the final consumption expenditure of government, that is the code P3S13, in Belgium, that is the country of origin. And like this, you have several million data points, and you can make many interpretations, or you can make many filtering or aggregation of that huge data set, depending on your policy question. Now, the communicating millions of data points is of course a challenge, and we have developed a very simple presentation of the numbers of the results, focusing on the European performance as concerns carbon footprints. And that is this table, and I just want to walk you through. So we have 34.4 billion tons of CO2 emissions worldwide. This is the data for the year 2020. And now you can decompose these global CO2 emissions in various ways. So first of all, 2.8 billion tons of these global emissions are emitted by the European production system, the European production activities. That means 8% of the global emissions. If you break down the production-related European emissions, you can break down into those serving EU consumption, which is 2.3, and serving consumption outside the EU, because the EU is also exporting products to the rest of the world. So the 2.8 production-related emissions are broken down into 2.3 and 0.5. But you can also look at the consumption-related emissions, that are the emissions which are due to the EU consumption. And this is 3.2 billion tons, 9% of the worldwide CO2 emissions. And again, you can see how much is served by EU production and how much is served by production in the rest of the world. As you can see, the production-related CO2 emissions are smaller than the consumption-related CO2 emissions. Here we have 8% of global emissions. Here we see 9% of global emissions. Now, we have produced these numbers for the time series. So in 2010, the European production was sort of, the share in the worldwide emissions was bigger. So it was 11%, the production-related emissions, and even 13% the consumption-based emissions. In 2015, it was already less, 9 and 10% respectively. In 19, it was 8 and 10. And in 20, which is a special year, the COVID year, it was 8 and 9% of global emissions. Yeah, the global emissions have increased until 2019, but then in the COVID year, of course, it was going down. Yeah, this what I want to say here is also this way of presentation might be interesting, or might become interesting. So imagine the EU has the target to halve their CO2 emissions by, I don't know, 2030 or so. So this 2.8 will be 1.4 or 1.5 or 1.6. So the share of EU's production-related emissions will be, in total worldwide emissions, will be much lower. But still, it will be interesting to see in how much the footprint of the consumption, the EU consumption, will look like in 10 years. But also the other way around, the import or the exports from EU to the rest of the world will embody less CO2 emissions. So, and that sort of cleaner produced products will serve consumption in the rest of the world. So I think these both perspectives will become very relevant in future.
Sorry, Stefan, could you wrap it up in like 2 or 3 minutes?
Yeah.
So that we can have a little bit questions as well.
Sure. Sorry. Yeah. Then I skip. We also can see where are the consumption-based emissions coming from, originating from. So they come basically from the US, China, and Russia. I skip this. So to summarize, consumption-based CO2 emissions are bigger than the production-based. The carbon footprint in the world has been, EU's carbon footprint has been decreasing. Yeah. And we have some findings about the most important trading partners. Now, the relation to Eurostat monitoring report, you're better familiar with the SDG monitoring than I am, but there's a direct link to footprint type indicators in SDG 12, responsible consumption and production, where I think one of the important indicators is material footprint. And in the Eurostat report, we also have a special chapter on spillover effects where all the data are included. So in the special chapter, we have carbon footprints, land use footprints, material footprints, and economic spillover effects. Yeah, that's it. Thank you. And I'm looking forward to your questions. Thank you.
Thanks a lot. I was very much interested in the trends of the production and consumption. They were very parallel, and you maybe couldn't get into detail, but your presentation is available for everybody who goes to the meeting website, so they can check by themselves. Thank you very much. Do we have some quick reactions? Okay. Yes, please. I have my own questions to both to Stefan and to the Flo. But I think you already elaborated on the analytical potential of carbon footprints. Stefan, I asked this, but you demonstrate an example related to India what was produced in India and how it was affected to Belgium, if I remember correctly. Can I ask you the second question, which was asked by Portugal, but I would like to repeat to you as well. What would be the best way, or is there a maybe hybrid way to reconcile the life cycle assessment-based approach and input-output table approach, bottom-up, top-down, and make the footprint measurements a strong complementary to sustainability, especially at regional and subnational level?
Difficult. As I made clear in my presentation, we have a clear methodological sort of framework, which is the national accounts. And also data-wise, I would say we are constrained to the data produced by statistical offices. So where I see a link to LCA is in the one or the other case, you may have to use some auxiliary information to break down your raw data. And as in the case of material flow counts, there we use some LCA information, LCA or life cycle inventory information. Otherwise, I do not see, at a methodological level, I do not see a reconciliation of the two approaches. My personal view is that life cycle assessment was developed for products and companies, and it was not developed for, measuring things at the national economy level. And I don't know in how far the life cycle inventory based results are benchmarked to international statistics like greenhouse gas statistics at a global scale or material extractions at the global scale or land use. So I don't know whether, the life cycle data really add up at the exact global values that we have in other statistics, in the international statistics. So that's not, I don't know whether this benchmark or whether they are matching. That's all I can say.
Okay, thank you very much. We have a remark from JRC. Yes, please, Esther.
Can quickly react. For example, in this analysis that you showed, Stefan, you were only talking about CO2 emissions, right? So in fact, here, some emissions contributing to climate change are not considered like methane or other relevant environmental pressure. So I think one of the aspects that I mentioned on why a life cycle inventory data or LCA has an advantage compared to input-output is, for example, on this more comprehensive coverage of emissions.
Thank you. If there's no more remarks, I'd like to conclude this part of the session and get back to you for the coffee break. Stefan, thank you very much for your presentation.
Thank you.
Okay, so now we deserve coffee break, and I invite you for 25 minutes of coffee break. So please be back at 4:30. Thank you. There is one draft slide, I think. So
What?
the second
Hi, everyone. I see that you're not tired. Yeah, who am I kidding, right? Okay. We'll conclude with the last presentation. Our last presenter is also joining us online, Victor Alvarez Arevalo Cabra. I hope I pronounced it correctly. He is a philosopher and master in social studies of science. He is currently a professor at the National University of Colombia. He is also working at National Administrative Department of Statistics, DANE's SDG unit. Mr. Arevalo has vast experience in many different aspects of the monitoring and follow-up of SDG indicators, so as I assume his background is quite relevant to this session 5. Victor, can you hear us?
Yes. Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for the invitation.
Good afternoon. The floor is yours, please, Victor.
Thank you very much. And again, thank you for having me in this meeting. I think it's very interesting for us to know this all experience and exercise that you have carried out. From our part, we are present our experience working with NLP models to measure some indicators, some SDGs indicators, in particular 2 indicators of the SDG 16. So the idea is to make a very brief presentation on our experience and measure these indicators. Please, we'll move on to the next slide, please. So in the first part, we talk about the requirements of information that motivate us to calculate this indicator using these alternative data sources. Then we very briefly, we talk about the methodology that you use. Then we will show some results and how we make the quality assurance that is very important for us. And then some remarks, conclusion, and lessons from our part. Next slide, please. Next. So the origin of the project is very simple. In fact, we have identified in our policy document called Compass some data gaps in terms of statistical information in the country, in different subjects, different problems and issues. And one of these data gaps that we have identified are the indicators 16.b.1 and the indicators 16.7.2. These 2 indicators are defined as a data gap. Colombia doesn't have information about these indicators, so we developed this strategy to calculate these 2 indicators, all of them using alternative sources and traditional sources. The idea, of course, is to articulate this experience with our initiative of experimental statistics. Dane has vast experience working with SDGs and with the estimation of SDG using alternative data and methods as different from surveys and so on. For example, in Dane, we calculate some indicators of the SDG 11 using satellite images. So the idea was to complement this experience working with NLP models. And the idea, of course, for us is also to take advantage of these NLP models in order to, based on the experience using these models, try to improve some internal process in that. So for this project, we received support for the Data for Now initiative. Next slide, please. Next slide. Very brief for this part. As I mentioned before, the idea was to calculate these 2 indicators. And in the first place, we made some web scraping from Facebook to gather comments from public posts, and then we made some treatment of this information in order to see if it was possible to calculate these indicators using the information of the comments and users and the different variables that we can find in this web scraping. The collection period is 2013 to 2022, and the scrapping was made in September 2021. Next slide, please. So for us, it was very important to create a strategy to a quality assurance strategy, because Dane is the coordinator of the National Statistical System in Colombia. So we are in charge of the statistical standards and their implementation in the country. So for that reason, for us, it was very important to make this exercise taking into account that the use and the implementation of the standards are the key factor for the success of the exercise. So this strategy was divided into parts. One part from the collection quality issues and the other part for the modeling quality. So for the collection, we developed a parallel scrapping and we try to make a demographic analysis. In that part, we find the more problems and issues with the exercise. And for the modeling part, we use NLP models, transformers, to be more precise, in order to make that exercise. And of course, we develop as well a labeling process with users of information in order to check the results of the NLP models. Please move to the next slide. So this is an example of the results of the application of the model. These are a short classification model. The model, in general terms, gives a probability to a comment to belong to some of the different types of discrimination that are defined in the methodology of the SDG indicator. And next slide, please. So based on that, you can find here, you can see some of the results regarding the two indicators. This is for the indicator of discrimination. As you can see here, this is the data from Facebook. The more prevalent type of discrimination is the political discrimination, and it makes a lot of sense based on the use that the Facebook users make to this social network. And the next most prevalent type of discrimination was cultural identity. These two types of discrimination are very different from the official information that calculate with traditional survey. Next slide, please. So we have information also disaggregated by sex, and as you can see here in our experience for some of these results, we can see the different types of discrimination, and in this case, the most prevalent for the different types of discrimination in our result, women present a more discrimination comments in our exercise. And next slide, please. So based on that information, we of course made a calculation of the indicator that you can see here for the different years that we have information. And for this case, the result for the year 2021 is 3.3%. So for the users that we identify in the web scraping and the comments that they made and the algorithm identify as discriminatory comments, the proportion of population is 3.3, And it's very different for the official information that is near to 10.3% of the population that declare to feel discriminated for any of the types of discrimination that you have seen in the previous slides. So the difference is high, taking into account the official and the information of this exercise. Next slide, please. So for the other indicator seeks for measure the different forms of representativity, the representativeness. One is the inclusiveness and one is the responsiveness. And for those types of representativeness in terms of political participation, the most prevalent type was inclusiveness. Next slide, please. And we developed the same exercise here. We disaggregated information by sex. And in this case, the difference between women and men is very different from the official information. In this case, men are more prevalent in both of types of discrimination, different that happen in the official information. Next slide, please. So you can see here the estimation of the indicator, and the indicator, on the contrary with the other indicator, this indicator is very close to the official information. The official information for this indicator is near to 52%. In this case, it's 47%. So the results are very close, but as you can see here, and in the other indicator, after 2019, the amount of data is increasing. So for us, it is related to the pandemic, of course, but also we think there was some bias in the collection method that could affect the result of both indicators. Next slide, please. So we can see here the difference between the official and the information calculated using Facebook data. So on left side, you can see the official the Facebook information, and in the right side, you can see the official information from the political culture survey, that is the official information in Colombia for estimation of discrimination. So in the case of the official information, the most prevalent type of discrimination is age. So this is different between the prevalent types of discrimination is a key factor to analyze in order to check if this data source is available for be part of the official information in the country. Next slide, please. Okay, you can see here the same, but with the other indicator, and as I mentioned before, the difference between the sex and the two types of discrimination is still high. So these differences in the proportion, despite they have the same tendency, is a key factor to analyze the representativity of these results. Next slide, please. One of the strategies, as I mentioned before, was the comparison of these results. You can see here the analysis of the performance of the model, and the more precise accuracy model was the model for the indicator 16.7.2, and you can see that accuracy in the results of the indicator. But when we try to analyze the representativity of these results, next slide please, we have very marked differences between the information in the country and the information in this social network. For example, you can see here in the two first graphics, the gender distribution in Colombia. Women are more prevalent in Colombia and in the social network, but when we analyze the information for our exercise, men are the most prevalent gender in our sample. So based on that and in the impossibility to get other variables like age, the representativity was, we can't analyze this representativity and we can make a more comprehensive representativity analysis of that information. And that's one of the main issues with this exercise. Based on the lack of this analysis, we have now that in this moment we are not quite sure if this could be a very official data source, and the most important is we are not quite sure if this kind of data sources could fulfill the entire statistical standards that we demand in the country. Next slide, please. So based on that, we think in particular for Facebook data, this data source represents enormous challenges in data collection and also in the processing and analysis. So we consider that this data source is not a feasible source for estimate official information in the country. It is feasible to use this information as a complementary contextual data source, but as an official information, we think the representativity problem is a very huge problem in these data sources. So next slide, please. So, but we think the contextual information could be very useful for the analyst. The analyst could take this information and compare with the official results and get more comprehensive landscape of the situation of discrimination in the country, of course, taking into account the representativity issues that I mentioned before. And the most important conclusion for us is the NLP models are useful and are feasible to be applied in the entity, not just for the estimation of the SDGs indicators, but some other kind of issues related to natural language processing and some more issues that requires the machine learning techniques. For example, the application of artificial intelligence algorithms to create virtual assistants for field work or to improve some internal process and so on. So actually, in this moment in DANE, we are replicate these NLP models in order to explore these possibilities to improve this internal processing in our entity. And we think this strategy could be also be applied for other institutions in the country. So the project doesn't present the results that we expect that show for these indicators, but the use of NLP and AI models are very important for us because we can grow and expand the possibility to use these methods to improve different processes internally. So, and in that sense, we think it's important to explore some other alternative sources. For example, use citizen science to generate more well-grounded surveys and methodologies to calculate some other indicators, and in particular some SDGs indicators. Next slide, please. So one of the main lessons there that we have for this exercise is the capacity building for the NSOs. It is important to these trainings and this capacity building be planned based on the needs present and in the future for the entity. And of course, the training should be developed in a more needs-driven and against the timelines planning in the project planning. So that's one of the key problems in our case, because we have a very tight schedule to produce these results, but some of these projects need some time for maturation of and we think it's important to take the time to analyze and see if these improvements are feasible in the end. So in that sense, it's one of the most important issues is to have better planning of activities and associated resources in order to optimize these activities. And particularly for the process of scrapping and other methods of collection data, we think the parallelization is a key factor in this case, because this parallelization process boosts the collection data if we want to scrape this kind of information. And this technique is also useful for other kind of indicators, for example, for the estimation of CPI of index prices. And I think that we all for my part, thank you very much for having me. Very glad to respond to your questions. Thank you.
Thanks a lot for your timely finishing. Do we have any quick reactions from the floor? It was, we have one from Portugal.
Thank you. Sorry, just a quick question, a curiosity. It's lateral. It's one of the bullets that was presented related with citizen science used for these SDGs. Is it possible to explain a bit better how this could be used, and would be developed by public institutions or by NGOs? Do you have any idea? And congratulations on the presentation. Very interesting. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Yes, we have another different project regarding also with discrimination. And the idea with this project was to create a web app in order that the citizens could fulfill as online survey in the web regarding the different questions that the methodology of the organization pose for the estimation of the indicator. So this is not exactly an citizen.
We have some connection issues, I guess, Victor. Can you hear us? No? Yeah, I guess it ended in both ways. Argenton, can we share my last question if possible? Since we are waiting for Victor's connection to be re-established, I have a question to the floor. Yeah, I mean, if you're interested, since we are, as Tina already mentioned in the beginning of the 2 days meeting, we are in the middle of our journey to the 2030 agenda. I think, and I honestly think that we shouldn't be any more late to have a clear path to deal with the hot potatoes such as governance, inclusion, discrimination, transparency, bribery, targets under the SDGs. We have some specific indicators, but it is a very hot potato for a National Statistical Office to deal with these issues. For example, in EU SDGs monitoring, Eurostat, I think, finally decided to include the Transparency International's composite index. So how should the whole sustainability committee deal with these issues? My humble suggestion is to further encourage using the summary measurement composite indices, especially for these hot potatoes, as the entry point. What do you think about it? Or is it a completely irrelevant question?
No. I think it's related with our project, and in our case, and in the case of Colombia, we our first approach was to attack the governance problem. So the idea was initially to create some institution and some governance related to SDGs. That was our first strategy, because we think if we can resolve the governance issue, we can then resolve the other hot potatoes, as you call. For example, inclusion, discrimination, transparency. They're all related with problems of governance. So the key issue for the SDGs monitoring and the acceleration of the 2030 agenda in the country was, create these governance and these institutions center of the SDGs, and then we can see how to resolve the inclusion and the discrimination problem and so on. So, for example, once we create this governance, with this very robust governance in the country related to the 2030 agenda, the next step was, so we have identified some data gaps regarding some excluded groups, like indigenous or ethnic groups. So how we can make this population visible. So internally in DANE, we create a group that is in charge to think and create strategies to modify, to change, or to create some service or some question, or modification of the service in our institution to include this population. This is one step, and other institutions in the country, of course, have other different strategies, but the governance is key to articulate these actors and these actions in the country. Of course, we need to improve some of these strategies, and some of these institutions could be work better. But I think the first step is have a robust governance.
Victor, thank you very much for your participation from that very long distance, and for the last minute change of plans. You were gladly adapted to the process and substituted your colleague. Thank you very much for your presentation, and let me conclude the session for everybody in order to timely finish. Now I can hear my own voice. Great. Yeah. As the conclusion of the session, when trying to expand the SDGs monitoring, we have 4 separate silos, and we will never get rid of either of them in a million years. I mean, maybe politicians. I mean, we can try to get rid of them, but I mean, especially national statistical offices will stay in their own place. They will not get into the analysis. They will not get into the evaluation, assessment level, and maybe it is best for them to keep these 2 silos separate. It's a good thing that they have their own different mandates to be reliable, to be consistent, and we will have academia research going as the frontiers. We will have assessments evaluation communities separately, and what should we do to better handle the sustainability monitoring and make the SDGs more relevant with these 4 different silos. These are the answers that I came up with as the conclusion of this session. We should better cooperate between these 2 stakeholders. We should employ innovative and experimental approaches. We should better align with the global sustainability monitoring community. So in parallel and in tandem with that, with the subject matter experts work such as CA. One example that I came up with, for example, we still have one FAO member. Hi, Georgi. And we, in the JRC's presentation, we talked about the food system transformation. Eurostat has their own different approach. National statistical offices produces lots of data, but none of us can separately overcome the proper monitoring of these single topic, this food system transformation. All these different actors should have to come together, not FAO, not national statistical offices, not JRC, not Eurostat, but all stakeholders should come together, break the silos, and handle this issue appropriately. I'm not talking about only the SDG indicator framework, handling this whole transformation as well. This will be the next step on monitoring the sustainability, and this will also pave the way to better level up with the subject matter experts in all separate areas of SDGs monitoring. And according to these different needs of capacity building, we should further transform the official statistics. We came a good long way in the 8 years, but it's definitely not enough, as we all agree, and we should further transform and accordingly develop the structure, the strategy, the legislation of our mandates as well. Thank you for listening this very long session. Thank you very much.
Okay.